Hi, my name is Lenny Furman, and welcome to this presentation in which we celebrate 100 years since the great journey to America of my great-grandma, Eva. This is Eva Pearlstein, my great-grandmother. She was born in 1890 in Russia, what is now Ukraine, and she lived to the age of 90. Here we also see her husband, my great-grandfather, Louis Pearlstein, who I am named after. In 1920, 7 years after the departure of her husband Louis, my great-grandmother Eva Pearlstein made the courageous journey from Russia to America with her two little girls, Mary, age 9, and Jenny, my grandmother, age 7, and her elderly father. This is the story of that journey. Everyone in this family tree owes their lives to Eva's great journey. This is not just a family tree, this is a descendants tree. Every person pictured here is a descendant of Eva. We're all very grateful to her courageous journey to come to America so we could have the great life that we have had here in this country. And now the story begins. Hundreds of years ago, the Russian Empire confined the Jews to an area in Eastern Europe that was called the Pale of Settlement. Millions of Jews lived in the Pale of Settlement. Eva lived in a region called Podolia. In the Pale, most Jews lived in small villages called shtetls. Eva lived in a shtetl called Yarmolinets, in what is today part of Ukraine. While at times Jewish life flourished, at others the Jewish community faced periods of persecution and anti-Semitic discriminatory policies. Beginning in 1881, things turned for the worse for the Jews. Tsar Alexander II was murdered in 1881. And as was typical, Jews were blamed for his death. Life for Russian Jewry from 1881 to 1920 became harsh. The Pale of Settlement was overcrowded. Job restrictions limited the ability of Jews to work. They faced extreme violence from the Russian peasantry. Life for the Jews got even worse under Tsar Nicholas II in 1894. Violence intensified as Russians were encouraged to attack Jews. Government agent propaganda led to dangerous pogroms. Emigration to America was a way to escape these awful conditions. However, the Russian government denied requests to leave. And this caused Jews to have to actually sneak across the border to escape Russia and come to America. Jews began to settle in Yarmolinets in the early 18th century. Over the years, Yarmolinets has gone by many names depending on the language it is written in. It is often referred to as Yarmolintsy, but can also be called Yarmolintsy with an I at the end, or Yarmolints. The Jewish population of the town suffered greatly during an attack by the Haidamaks, a Ukrainian Cossack paramilitary band, in 1768. In 1897, the Jewish population of Yarmolinets stood at 2,633, comprising 50% of the total population. In 1919, during the Russian Civil War, a pogrom was carried out in the town. Today, the town is called Yarmolintsy in Ukrainian and has a population of 8,800, according to the 2001 Ukraine census. For much of this story, we will now hear directly from Eva's grandchildren. First, we're going to hear from Missy, as she describes how Eva's father, Yaakov Kritterman, became the overseer for a government farm, which always ensured that they had food.
He was approached by who they called the prince. He was a Russian guy or a Ukrainian guy, because Grandma always said, not Russia, Ukraine, which she spoke. She understood it. She also understood Russian. He came to Kreiderman and said, I have this small farm and I want you to be the overseer. And that was wonderful because that meant they had eggs and they had milk. And that was very, 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 very important.
Now we're going to hear from my mother, Arlene, as she describes Eva's shtetl home.
It was a wooden hut, and it was a dirt floor, and they had, my mother describes it perfectly. You'd walk in, a little door, a little window, one room, a wooden dirt floor, a little potbelly stove, a little table for them to eat at, and the bed. There's a bed there, right there. The grandmother was by the bed, by the potbelly stove. They climbed a ladder to get to a loft, and I guess Mary and Jenny and they slept upstairs, and the grandparents slept downstairs. They had a bomb thrown at their house by Cossacks. Luckily, it landed outside in the ground, never went off.
Now, Missy also describes the shtetl home.
It was this one room dwelling. They're sleeping on like hay beds, but there was a huge, there's a word for it, the hearth. So there's always something cooking on the hearth, right? You could always cook things. You had chickens, so you had eggs, you had milk, you had cows. It wasn't big. There were a couple of chickens. There was a couple of cows. That's how I always heard it. We had eggs, we had milk. We had eggs, we had milk. They had enough that they could survive, they could eat.
Arlene describes why Louis needed to escape Russia in 1913.
He was called up to the army, as was a group of other men in this town. He already had Mary as a little baby, and my grandmother was pregnant with my mother. And the boys knew that if they get called up in the army, they never come home. The Jewish boys went to Siberia, never came home again. They were sent off to Siberia. Goodbye. The families never saw them. They knew what was in store for them, so they ran. They ran over the border. They stole one night. They ran over the border, and they found their way, however they did, to get on a ship, also stowaway, and get over here.
Now, Alan describes how Louis saw the revolution coming and wanted to get established in America.
What I remember is that my grandmother used to tell the story. My grandfather went to the United States and started a business here. And what I understood is that he saw that the revolution was coming, the Tsar was going, and that the best thing for him to do is get out of there, come to the United States, make a business, and then bring my mother and Jenny over to the United States.
And Judy says that Louis had brothers who were already in America.
But he left because his brothers were already in America. And so he left because they probably told him, you can make money here. So he went on his own to America because she was protected by living with her father and her mother on the farm. So he wasn't leaving her isolated. And he went to make his fortune, and then he called for her when he could call for her.
And Missy describes why Eva's mother was bedridden, and so Eva had to stay behind in 1913.
This is what I've always heard from Grandma. They live in Yarmolinis. As you know, Eve is an only child because when she was born, her mother, I have no idea what the woman's name is, something happened. She said she lost her stomach. After that, could only lie. She would just be bedridden. Bedridden was a hayloft, right, in where they lived.
Now, Missy further discusses the original plan for Eva and the girls to come to America after Louis had left.
Louis leaves and goes to America where he already has brothers. I think he went to see Morris. Morris was here. And the plan was that after the grandmother dies, because she's bedridden, then Eva with Charnia and Nasia and Kreiderman will come to America. And they'll meet up with Louis, who was here making a life.
But it would be 7 years until Eva could leave Ukraine to follow Louis to America. And those 7 years, from 1913 to 1920, were among the most difficult and dangerous times in all history. In Ukraine, from 1913 to 1920, they experienced World War I, the Russian Revolution, the flu pandemic, the Russian Civil War, the pogroms, the typhus epidemic, and the Soviet-Polish War. During World War I, the Western Ukrainian people were situated between Austria-Hungary and Russia. Ukrainian villages were regularly destroyed in the crossfire. Ukrainians could be found participating on both sides of the conflict. Fighting in the Ukraine actually escalated with the beginning of the Russian Revolution in 1917. The Russian Revolution began a civil war within the Russian Empire, and much of the fighting took place in the Ukrainian provinces. Many atrocities occurred during the Civil War as the Red, White, Polish, Ukrainian, and Allied armies marched throughout the country. Judy describes Jenny and Mary being hidden from the soldiers around 1917.
The other story I remember really comes from my mother in 1917 being hidden in a home, in a neighbor's home, because the soldiers were going to come get her. And she remembers being hidden, that my grandmother hid her and Mary in someone's non-Jewish home.
Judy further describes that Mary and Jenny were taken in by a non-Jewish family to protect them from the soldiers.
It sounded to me like it was for a few days that this family took Mary and Jenny in. Now, whether they took my grandmother in because they could have raped her too, she was a young woman, I don't know. But I do know what my mother told me about the soldiers.
Missy describes that Eva did what she needed to do in order for her family to survive.
I never heard her say that anything was difficult. Even when she would talk about the pogroms and hiding Mary and Jenny with the nice Gentile woman who lived in the town, who would take in Mary and Jenny and hide them from the soldiers. You know, she didn't even talk about this as being difficult. She just did what you need to do.
Missy further describes how Jenny and Mary were very much in danger.
Whatever it was, they were in danger. These girls were in danger. That she was very clear about. Like I said, she never said anything was hard, but she did say when her daughters were in danger, yes. And she protected them.
The deadly influenza pandemic raged through Europe and peaked in 1919 as it ravaged Ukraine with high infection rates and severe symptoms. Many who became ill subsequently died because of extensive war damage to healthcare facilities and services. In addition to influenza, a deadly typhus outbreak occurred in the area in 1919. An article in an American newspaper described the situation as desperate. A rapidly spreading epidemic, which has already killed hundreds of people in villages, in large part due to the destruction of medical facilities and the depletion of supplies over 5 years of constant warfare. Medical leaders are aghast at the intensity of the situation, which eclipses anything ever known in this land, where typhus has always been more or less epidemic, and express fear of unprecedented death rates in the coming winter, traditionally the peak period for the disease. Survival was made even more difficult by the intense cold. And here Missy describes the cold.
Grandma Jenny always talked about how cold it was. In Yarmulin, it was freezing cold all the time. You know, she wanted the Cossacks' boots because that was warm. Their shoes, they had, were like lined with paper. It was always freezing. She was always freezing.
The pogroms in the Ukraine lasted from 1917 to 1921, and they represent the largest and bloodiest anti-Jewish massacres in the world prior to the Holocaust. The estimated number of Jews murdered in Ukraine ranges as high as 200,000 during this period. Many more Jews there suffered violence, rape, and loss of property. Missy describes how Eva avoided being raped by soldiers.
Said one day at one of the pogroms, I don't know how many there were, but the soldiers were there and they were going to rape Grandma because that was one of the things that they did. They wanted the girls were gone. They didn't know the girls lived there. The girls were hidden, but they were going to harm Grandma. They were going to rape her. And she told the story and she said, that's fine, whatever you got to do, but let me just tell you, I have syphilis. So they left her alone. It's just, she never said anything was hard. She did what she had to do.
The Polish-Soviet War was fought by the Second Polish Republic and the Soviet Union from February 1919 to October 1920 over a region that is today in westernmost Ukraine where Yarmolinets is. Vladimir Lenin saw Poland as the bridge the Red Army had to cross to assist other communist movements and bring about more European revolutions. And now Alan describes how it was that Eva managed to survive with her daughters and her father through all of this between 1913 to 1920.
They say that she was a very strong woman. She took things in her own hands and, brought them through all this by herself. It was a tough life. She went through a hard period of time. But if they were going to survive, she had to be the strong one.
I thought I was always told that they owned a dairy farm, and one of the things that saved them was when the Russian soldiers came through, they would give them milk and cheese and stuff, and that's how they survived and weren't killed or anything.
And Arlene describes how they had to wait until her invalid mother passed away before they could leave Russia.
And they couldn't leave right away. They could have left earlier, but her mother needed surgery, and they couldn't get to Kiev to get the surgery because she was bedridden, and they didn't have the money to do everything, and they didn't have the means to get her there. So they waited until she passed on. It could have been a couple of years.
Missy also describes how when her mother died, then they tried to find Louis, but he was missing in America.
So the grandmother dies, but we don't know where Louis is. Louis disappeared. This according to Grandma. But there was an agency that would help Jewish women find their husbands who went to America and disappeared. So the agency knew where he was in America, where he was in New York. They tracked him down. So Grandma says, okay, we're going to go.
And so Judy describes how Eva and family are finally ready to leave Russia.
They lived on a very small farm. She was an only child. She, her father, Yitzhak Kreiderman. Her mother was very sickly all the time, and she wouldn't leave her mother to go to America until her mother died. And when her mother died, that's when she went with her father, with a doctor, because Mary was sick and they wanted to make sure she passed through. Jenny, Mary, Eva, Mr. Kreiderman, and a doctor went on this ship.
Arlene describes how Eva managed to save 300 rubles to pay for the trip.
Grandma had to save up 300 rubles to pay. This man was going back and forth from America to their area of the Ukraine and their little town and everything, and he was taking people back and forth.
How did Eva get the money? We don't know, and we probably will never know precisely. When did they leave exactly? We only know for certain that they arrived in New York on August 21st, 1920. At a minimum, they would have had to have left Yarmolinets in early July. What we do know is that around the time they left, in July 1920, two prominent American Jewish professors went on a dangerous mission to the Ukraine to personally deliver millions of dollars of charity to desperate Jews. The American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee had raised $5 million in 1920 for the relief of Jews in Poland and the Ukraine. On July 5th, 1920, the two Jewish Distribution Committee emissaries, Israel Friedlander and Bernard Cantor, were killed near Yarmolinets. It was an apparent robbery, as it must have become known that they were carrying millions of dollars in cash. So beloved were these two Jewish men that were murdered that when the news reached back home, it was the subject of articles for 3 consecutive days in the New York Times from July 11th to July 13th, 1920. Here we see an article in the New York Times on July 12th, 1920, that told the story of the murder of the American Jewish emissaries near Yarmolinets. This is the only mention of Yarmolinets in the entire 170-year history of the New York Times. Notice here the spelling is Yarmolintz, but we now know this was another name for Yarmolinets. The story had first appeared in the New York Times the previous day on July 11th. And additional details were provided on July 13th in the New York Times. Included in this paragraph on July 13th was a story of what it was like in Yarmolinets. As the article says in the last paragraph, it is virtually impossible to bring home to people here the frightful conditions existing in the Ukraine. Some questions we may never answer. When exactly did Eva leave Yarmolinets? If she was still there on July 5th, did she receive any of the assistance from the two American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee professors before they were murdered? It is possible. In any event, the journey from Russia to America now begins. The journey from Russia to America begins at a date that is probably precise date that we may never exactly know. It's most likely that they left sometime around early July. As you can see here, Yarmolinets is positioned deep in the Ukraine, in the western part of Ukraine. So that was their starting point for this great journey. And we do know that hidden in a hay wagon, they crossed the border to Poland. And here is Alan describing how they traveled.
I mean, I think it's sort of like Fiddler on the Roof. I mean, carts, feet, wagons. I don't think anything mechanized.
And here's Missy talking about how they had to sneak out of Russia.
I think this is a different agency, helped Jews sneak out of Russia, out of Ukraine, to get to America. So you were in a wagon filled with hay, and you were like covered with the hay or something. They snuck you out to get across Europe and to get to, as you say, to London, to England, so that they can get on the boat, get to America, and reunite with the husband that got found. And so that's what Grandma does. I don't know how they got the money for it. I don't know the details of it, but this agency sneaks them out. As far as I know, it's Kreiderman who is.
So we don't know the exact details, but here is a historian's description of the journey that other Jews had from this region at that time. They said they received coaching and information from ticket agents whose job it was not only to sell the tickets, but help the travelers arrive as safely as possible. The costs of food and lodging were most often bundled into the overall price of the combination railway steamship ticket. They were warned of what immigration control agents, official border inspectors, and steamship authorities wanted to know. They were told to say that they had a given amount of money to convince authorities they were not paupers. Some were cheated out of their steamship tickets. From Poland, they took trains to a major part of embarkation, which were Hamburg, Bremen, Rotterdam, Amsterdam, and Antwerp. The railway journey took about a week or longer. The large European steamship companies had agents all over Western and Central Europe and were known to carve up these territories so that all had a share of the migration market. And we also have similar accounts to ours from other Jewish families from Ukraine. Here's an account from Mary Jo C. Martin of the Jewish Ancestry in Ukraine Facebook group. She describes, "My paternal grandfather arrived in New York on the Aquitania on 10 December 1921. They boarded Cherbourg, France, after living in Paris for 11 months. The family came from Krasliv, Khmelnytsia, Ukraine, escaping in the back of a hay wagon. They crossed the border at night. Some soldiers pitchforked the hay with bayonets, but luckily no one was hurt. They crossed into Poland, then Germany, to France. My grandfather always said that someone from the Heinz family of ketchup fame helped them along the way, and he always admired them greatly." Another gentleman in this Jewish Ancestry in Ukraine Facebook group says, "My family walked from Belava Serkov to the ship at Southampton in 1921. And here's other similar accounts. "My paternal grandparents, dad and aunt, left the Ukraine in 1921. They had to get to Riga, Latvia by themselves. The journey to Riga was mostly by wagon. Sometimes they had to hide under straw, and many times they went hungry. Dad likened the trip, and I mean no disrespect, to the Underground Railway in the United States. The family was handed off along the hazardous journey to people who knew where they could buy their way through borders. One of my grandmother's brothers-in-laws had made arrangements that once the family got to Riga, Kennard would take care of them. I don't know exactly how they got to Southampton other than, as Dad would say, their troubles were over." Exactly when they were crossing through Poland, we don't know. But around this time, the Soviet Union invades Poland. Here we see articles in the New York Times in early August of 1920 describing the Soviet invasion of Poland, which caused many people to flee Warsaw. So it was an incredibly dangerous time to be going through Poland. And at this time, while they're in Poland, Mary is stricken with rheumatic fever. Missy describes Mary getting sick in Poland.
Mary got sick sneaking, out of Russia. That's when Mary contracted rheumatic fever. Then they're traveling across Europe, and Grandma takes her to a doctor. They're in Poland. They didn't get very far. And the doctor says, she's very, very ill. If you try to take her all the way across Europe, she'll die. I mean, the only way that can happen is if you carry her. And this is how Grandma told the story. And she said, so I carried her.
It is unknown exactly how or what path they traveled to go from Poland to Southampton, England, where we know they embarked to New York. Perhaps, though, they may have gone to the port of Danzig, Poland, and took a ship to England. And the reason we think this could be is a New York Times article on August 17th, 1920, that describes that many Jews took that route. And here is the New York Times article on August 17th, 1920, which describes how many Jews left from Danzig to get to Southampton. In the article, an agent from a Jewish relief agency describes, "We have made arrangements with the Cunard and White Star lines to transport immigrants from Danzig to England, whence they are to go direct to America." Further on in the article, this same agent, Mr. Kaimaki, says, "Immigrants can leave every week with the help of our commission. several hundred Jewish families are arriving with our assistance on the Aquitania. And then he further describes at the end how in Danzig, the immigrants had to remain 12 days in quarantine before they got on the ship because of the typhus epidemic that was raging there. So there is strong reason for us to believe now that from the New York Times article on August 17th, 1920, that this Jewish agent is speaking about the journey specifically taken by our family. And the reason we have good reason to believe this is that the agent specifically mentioned that Jewish families were on their way to New York on the Aquitania that week. And as we're going to see shortly, we know definitively that our family, Eva, Mary, Jenny, and her father, were on that sailing of the Aquitania. So our best assumption right now is that Eva took this route through Danzig, where they would have had to quarantine for 12 days due to that typhus epidemic. And then we know that once they get to Southampton, they take an ocean liner, third class, which was known as steerage, on board the Aquitania, the name of the ship. Now, how do we know that they left Southampton, England, on August 14th, 1920, on the Aquitania, and arrived in New York on August 21st, 1920? Well, this was the major find in the research. My wife, Heather, found Eva's petition for naturalization to become an American citizen. And the petition shows the departure and arrival ports and the dates and the name of the ocean liner. This was the key finding that pegged the date that we never knew for their exact arrival in America and how they got here, on what ship. And here you see a blow up of this petition. And so it shows Eva's name and that she embarked from Aquitania, arrived in New York on the, she embarked from Southampton, arrived in New York on the Aquitania, and the dates were leaving Southampton on August 14th, arriving in New York on August 21st. And so that New York Times article on August 17th is referring to Jewish families on the Aquitania. We are one of those families. And so this led to another fascinating part of this story. As I looked up information about the Aquitania, it turns out the Aquitania was part of the Cunard line, a very famous line of ships. And the Aquitania itself is fascinating to learn about. The Aquitania is regarded as one of the top 20 ocean liners in history. It was comparable to the Titanic. It was one of the most, or it was the most luxurious Cunard ocean liner at that time. It was in fact built by Cunard to compete with the Titanic's sister ship in the White Star Line, the Olympic. And this is a photo of the Aquitania in the summer of 1920. The Aquitania was so famous it had a nickname. It was known as the Ship Beautiful. And here's some quick facts about the Cunard Aquitania, the Ship Beautiful. It was 900 feet long. It weighed 45 tons. It could travel at 23 knots. That's as fast as any cruise ship today. It's been rated as one of the 20 greatest ocean liners in history. It is one of only 14 four-funneled ships ever made. It is comparable to the Titanic in size. For those of you who know cruise ships now, it's comparable in size to the Royal Caribbean Voyager of the Seas. It carried 597 first-class passengers, 614 second-class passengers, and a little over 2,000 third-class passengers. Also, there were a little more than 900 crew members. The maiden voyage was made from Liverpool to New York in May of 1914, and the ship made just 3 voyages before World War I was broken out, and it was taken over by the British Navy for wartime use. It wasn't until July of 1920 that it sailed again for commercial purposes, and the August 14th, 1920 sailing that our family was on was the first one on Aquitania's new route from Southampton to New York. Now, our family was not traveling on first class, not traveling on second class. They were traveling on third class, which was known as steerage. So they would not have experienced the opulence that you see in the movie Titanic that many of the first class passengers on the Aquitania would have experienced. And here I have found some pictures of what it was like in steerage on the Aquitania. Now, steerage by 1920 was much better than steerage had been on ocean liners in the 1880s, 1890s, and early 1900s. Here we see the dining room on the Aquitania in the 1920s in the steerage class. And here is an actual cabin in the 1920s on the Aquitania. So you can see there's multiple beds in the room. There's a sink. There is no bathroom in the room. There's a common bathroom somewhere in the hallway. And it was not possible, even if they would have been in first class, it would not have been possible for Eva and family to enjoy the crossing because Mary was still very ill with rheumatic fever while she was on the ship. And my mother, Arlene, is going to describe how a doctor helped Mary on board.
She came with her father and Jenny and Mary. They're in their group. There was a doctor from her little area. He came also. When they were on the trip, before they even got on the ship, Mary got rheumatic fever, and the doctor took over her grandma and taking care of Mary because they had to hide the fever. They had to hide that she was sick. Whatever, he just made it so. I guess he got her fever down at times so that she can get through. My mother picked it up also, but a very mild case. But Mary ended up, because they were on the run, they were going, and she had, when she was on the ship, and they had to get her as best that they could to make her look like she can get off the ship and walk through Ellis Island. Otherwise, you're tested and you have to go back. But Mary made it. But Mary ended up with a rheumatic heart. That's why she was sick all her life.
And now Alan and Mary Ellen will further describe the time while Mary was sick on the ship.
She had a heart, what is it called? She had rheumatic fever.
Rheumatic fever. And she became very sick on the boat. They weren't sure she was going to make it.
But she always had rheumatic fever and heart problems.
Yeah, she always had, and she always had a heart doctor after she had me.
Here is a picture of the Aquitania arriving in New York just weeks prior to Eva's sailing. This picture was taken on July 25th, 1920. And here is another photo that was taken from the Aquitania as it sailed past the Statue of Liberty. We know that this picture was taken sometime in the latter half of 1920. It's possible it could have been on Eva's sailing. News of the August 21st arrival was covered in the New York Times. It was the custom of that time, when a large ocean liner arrived, that the New York Times ran a story of notable people on board and what was the latest news from Europe that they had brought with them. The day after the arrival of the Aquitania, the New York Times ran such a story. And here it is, the New York Times on August 22nd, 1920, with the headline, "Notables Arrive on the Aquitania." Now, of course, our family being in steerage was not among the notables, but the article talked about some of the prominent people. The most prominent one was a Lord Beaverbrook, who was the chief proprietor of the London Daily Express. In addition, the Times describes a municipal court judge, Aaron Levy, who was returning from Poland, about which he said the conditions were misery indescribable, and that he had heard of many pogroms. Now, there was great anxiety upon Eva's family's arrival at Ellis Island. U.S. officials at Ellis Island conducted 6-second physicals of all immigrants that debarked an incoming ship, and they turned back any person that was ill or mentally challenged. The rejected people were returned to the ship and sent back to Europe at the ocean liner's expense. there was great anxiety about Mary's condition and whether she would pass the physical. And here my mother describes the Ellis Island physical.
You couldn't go through Ellis Island without having a physical done. If you had bad eyes, you were turned around immediately. If you had any kind of condition that was noticeable, you were turned around immediately to go home, go back to where you came from.
And here Alan and Mary Ellen also describe getting through Ellis Island.
Mary Ellen and my grandmother became very close after we got married. And she used to talk to her and tell her a lot of things about her coming to the United States.
Well, I just remember, she would say that the one thing when you entered the United States, they actually had doctors, and if you were sick, they would turn you back and send you back. So they nursed her to an extent, like they hit her every time, somebody would come by. But they nursed her so that once they got through immigration, she was healthy enough that they sent her through. Because she had the rheumatic fever, she couldn't help, she couldn't do a lot.
And Judy describes Eva's family giving their names and birthdays at Ellis Island.
And they came over with their Hebrew names. So they have Charna is Jenny, Magda is Mary, and Chavid is my grandmother, which became Eva. That's how we grew up, with knowing those birthdays that they were given at Ellis Island. How do you know that this is your birthday? And she said, because my mother told them that I was born around Shavuos.
Yeah.
And that Mary was born around Tisha B'Av. And that's how they came up with their dates. That's what she told me.
And now my mother relays a story that happened shortly after they got off the boat with 7-year-old Jenny.
When my mother got off the boat, and she told me the story over and over and over again, they were selling pomegranates, from a cart, pomegranate, and they must have had pomegranates a lot where they lived in the Ukraine, because she loved it. And she asked my grandmother for a pomegranate, and my grandmother said, I can't buy it for you. I don't have the money.
And here is another Jewish immigrant's account of arriving in New York. This is Mary Jo C. Martin, of the Jewish Ancestry in Ukraine Facebook group. She writes, my paternal grandfather arrived in New York on the Aquitania on 10 December 1921. The first thing he saw of America was the Statue of Liberty. They were nearly not admitted at Ellis Island because their mother was sick. Also, one of the children appeared to have Down syndrome, so I don't know how they got in. And now Eva and family are in New York, and my mother will describe a little bit of life in New York City in the 1920s.
She got to New York. They had an apartment on, I guess Grandpa had an apartment for them on Canal Street in Lower East Side, and it was a 5-floor walk up. Mary couldn't do it. So she couldn't go to school because she couldn't walk the steps anywhere. It was too much for her heart. So she stayed home. She didn't go to school. My mother went to school. And when my mother finished 8th grade, her father said, you have to help us in the store. You can't work. You have to go out and work. You cannot go to high school.
And now Judy will also describe how Mary and Jenny could not go to school.
When they're in Williamsburg, and that she had to be taken out of school. This is my mother talking, that she had to be taken out of school and work in the bakery because she was needed there. And Mary, who was sickly, had a heart condition, she stayed home, and she was like the woman of the house, and she took care of Jaime, and she did all the cooking, cleaning, and baking because my mother helped in the store, and my mother wanted to go to school.
And now Missy will describe what it was like living in a tenement in New York City in the 1920s.
They lived in this one-room apartment. I went to the tenement museum on the Lower East Side, and I told my father about it. He said, "That's us. That's like where we lived. That's how we lived. One bedroom or just one room. The kitchen is like a wall. Toilets in the hall, if you can call it a toilet, and they were sleeping, just whoever could sleep wherever, however." And Mary and Jenny and my dad were sleeping head to toe, toe to head to toe on a bed.
And finally, in 1931, Eva becomes an American citizen. This is her certificate of citizenship. And then in the 1930s, Eva buys a business and moves to New Jersey with her family. My mother's going to describe this.
That's what they had, a bakery kind of general store. And they would have to start baking at 4 in the morning. And that was too tiring for her. Mary took care of it. Mary became the mother of Hi. Mary raised Hi because she was in the store. When she realized that she couldn't keep this up, it was too much for them, and my grandfather was not a strong man, she decided to look further to see what she could, buy. And I don't know whether she contacted somebody or she read it in the paper, but she found the Quaker bus for sale and came and bought it. It was a bus stop, Quaker bus. She had a restaurant in it. She had a lot of chairs and tables, big place. And the buses from Philadelphia to New York had to stop there to refuel. They couldn't make the whole trip without refueling, and to give the people on the bus a chance to use the bathrooms and someplace to eat. And this is what she bought. She went ahead and did it. She looked around where they could go live, and Edison she wasn't too thrilled with Edison. She saw Highland Park and fell in love with it because it was a very Jewish community, and they were starting a temple, and they became founders of the temple. And they moved to Highland Park. I think they bought that place in late 34, maybe 35. They were in that place, and they were going to end up living with my parents, with Eva and Louis, right, and Jaime, and Mary. Mary wasn't married yet. So they all lived together.
Now my mother will describe how the business flourished thanks to the 1939 World's Fair.
In 1939, I was born, and 39 was the World's Fair in New York. Everybody who wanted to go to the World's Fair, which was a big, big thing from Philly, would have to go to New York by bus. And they went on Quaker bus, and they had to stop at my grandmother's place. My grandmother made a lot of money those few years.
And now let's take a look at some pictures. This is the earliest picture I have been able to find of Eva. This is in the late 1920s with her son Hi. Hi was born in the United States after they had arrived in 1921. Here we see Jenny, Mary, and Hi approximately in 1932. That's Jenny in the foreground, Mary right behind Jenny, and of course Hi, the younger brother, right behind them. So Jenny and Mary were born in Ukraine and Russia, made the journey over. Hi was born here in the United States in New York in 1921. Here we see Jenny and Mary again, Jenny in the front in 1933. And here is Jenny on the left and Joe in the middle, Mary on the right, and Arlene and Alan Weinberg as a little boy in the mid-1940s. Here we see Jenny and Eva in the middle and Mary on the right in approximately 1950. Here is Louis on the left, Judy as a young girl, Eva and my mother in the back right, sometime in the early 1950s. On the left here, actually both pictures are Louis and Eva at my parents' wedding, Arlene and Stanley, in 1959. And here is a family wedding picture at Arlene and Stanley's wedding in 1959. And this is the first picture of Eva and me shortly after I'm born. I guess I'm about 3 months old there in 1963. Here is, from left to right on the back, Arlene, Jenny, Eva, and Mary, and then my sister, Lisa. And this is in July of 1969. And then here on the left is Eva, Jenny, Joe, and Mary, sometime in the 1970s approximately. And Eva and my dad, Stanley, on the right at Alan and Judy's wedding in 1969. And here is a family picture with Eva, third from the left, at Judy and Alan's wedding in 1969. Here is Stephen and Missy with Eva in 1970. And here's Lisa, my mother, Arlene, Jenny, and Eva sitting down at my bar mitzvah in 1976. Now I'm going to play for you about 2 minutes of family video. That's Judy in the baby carriage. Mary and Jenny. My mother, Arlene. And that's Eva. That's Alan there on the left. That's my dad's parents, Estelle and Julius. Judy in the middle and Mary in the back. And there's Louis sitting at the head of the table. Jenny right behind Louis. And there is Eva just to the left. And my parents in the back left. There's Eva again. And Judy right in front of her. Here's Jenny again. And there's Judy again. Estelle, my father's mother. And my father and his father, Julius. Judy, Eva, and you can see my grandfather, Jenny's husband, Joe, in the white shirt, drinking the wine. Eva just next to him on his left, in the middle of the picture there, sitting down. So now we'll hear again from the grandchildren about what Eva's life was like in the 1940s through the 1960s. Here's Alan.
You know, she was a person who wanted to better herself, and she worked really hard. And she took good care of Alan because his parents worked. You know, and he doesn't say that much, but I mean, you know, his grandmother really was the person who made him his meals and took care of him. You know that, Alan.
Oh, yeah. No, lunch and dinner were my grandmother.
And my mother describes another great trip that Eva went on late in her life in the mid-1960s.
When they came here, they went to Canal Street, and then they bought the bakery, and I think the bakery, they went to Williamsburg. They went to Williamsburg to live for a while, and then she said that's enough, and she looked further out here. She looked, and she found out here the Quaker bus. So she came. She was very, very strong. She came here. She went right to night school to learn English. So she was, and stayed a while, met an Israeli couple in the same class, and they went good 3-4 years to this class. She learned how to read and write English, and these people still had their home in Israel. And when I was pregnant with Lisa, she decided to go by herself with this couple to they invited her to go to Israel. She went for 2 months and stayed with them. They took her all over Israel. She had such a wonderful time. So that was a nice experience for her. For all her years of working, this was her big vacation.
And now Judy will describe a story about Eva in the 1960s.
Because being the youngest, I got close to her, and when I went off to college, she went and took some kind of night class to learn how to write better English so that she could write letters to me. And she wrote letters to me when I was at college.
And Alan will talk about how his mother, Mary, was weak her whole life, as she was never able to fully recover from the heart damage due to the rheumatic fever during the trip.
Because the stories I always heard was when Eva had her bake shop, the bus stop, she really couldn't help that much because she was always tired and weak. You know, most of her life she had a heart condition because it was an untreated case of rheumatic fever. So that developed into heart issues.
Looking back, it's incredible that Eva was able to will her family to survive through all the calamities from 1913 to 1920 and make that incredible journey. Judy will describe the character of Eva.
She was a strong woman. She was a strong Russian woman. She was powerful. Nothing seemed to get her. And she was built like a babushka woman. She had strong hands, as if she had worked the fields, and she was built full.
And Judy will describe further.
Yeah, well, when you think about it, it is amazing that she made it, But I guess my grandmother was determined to go at that time. And she was going to go and take her chances. See, she wasn't. Now, if that was my mother making the decision, my mother would turn back and go back to the farm. But my grandmother was tough. And she had to be tough. She had to be a risk taker, and she had to be tough to do what she did.
Now, what happened after Eva left Russia? Well, shortly afterwards, U.S. immigration laws began to change. In 1921 and 1924, the U.S. Congress passed immigration laws that severely limited the number and national origin of new immigrants. These laws did not change even in the 1930s as desperate Jewish refugees attempted to immigrate from Nazi Germany. Here we see a New York Times article that talks about the severe quotas that went into place that made it almost impossible for Russian Jews to come to America by 1924. And what happened specifically in Yarmolинец after Eva left? Well, there were still many Jews there. In 1939, the Jewish population was 1,264. The Nazis occupied the town on July 8th, 1941. And in October 1942, the Jews were taken and held in the former military barracks located near the Yarmolинцы railway station with Jews from neighboring towns. 14,000 Jews were murdered there, including 5-year-old Milya Ravner. Jews tried to put up armed resistance, during which they killed several Ukrainian auxiliary policemen and Germans, but it was to no avail. Yarmolинцы was liberated by the Red Army on March 27, 1944. But by then, it was too late for many Jews that were killed in the Holocaust, including this young girl in the picture here, 5-year-old Milya Ravner, who was murdered by the Nazis on August 9th, 1941. And so everyone in this picture here truly does owe their life to Eva. Mary and Jenny likely would have not survived the Holocaust if they had stayed behind in Yarmolинец. And none of us below Mary and Jenny, nor Hy, would be here if Eva hadn't held the family together through such calamitous times and successfully made that journey, given all the hurdles and Mary being sick. It was truly a courageous journey. And so we all have to say, thank you, Eva. Thanks, great-grandma, on this 100-year anniversary of the great journey. And so that concludes the story. If anybody has questions or wants to share comments about this presentation, please feel free to contact me. Here is my email and phone number. I'd be very happy to speak with you. And so that's it. Thank you very much for watching this presentation and sharing in my story of my great-grandma, Eva. Thank you very much.